Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to you, wherever you are in the world. I am Tigress Osborne. I'm the chair of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, and welcome to the NAAFA Webinar Series. Today's episode of the NAAFA Webinar Series is focusing on fat justice and features Brandie Sendziak from FLAIR Project, the Fat Legal Advocacy and Rights Education Project. I'm going to introduce you to Brandie and our special extra guest in just a moment. Before I do that, I'm just going to make a couple of announcements. First of all, thank you to our friends at Pro Bono ASL who are providing ASL interpreting for us for today's webinar and who have been doing so throughout Fat Liberation Month. We are so grateful to the team at Pro Bono ASL, which includes a lot of folks, and the folks it includes today are Rory and Selena. So thank you, Pro Bono ASL. You can find out more about Pro Bono ASL at their website, which is simply probonoasl.com. I also want to tell you that you have arrived here for the last webinar of Fat Liberation Month. As many of you know, May 2021 has been our first ever Fat Liberation Month at NAAFA, and we've provided a variety of entertainment and education throughout the month. This is the last officially educational piece, although you'll certainly be able to learn some fun things in our remaining two pieces. Those two pieces are our Fat Trivia Challenge this Saturday at 1 p.m. Pacific. You can sign up for the Fat Trivia Challenge with any level of experience with Fat Liberation Month history or Fat Liberation history, any level of experience with trivia about fat activist life. You will, if you sign up with other team members, you'll play together. If you sign up solo, we'll put you on a team and you can make some new fat, fabulous friends. You don't have to already be a master of fat liberation history to do this trivia. And I will tell you that if you've been with us for lots of events this month, you've learned some of these things along the way, and you've probably learned way more than you think you have. So please join us for the Fat Trivia Challenge. That registration is available on our website at naafa.org. We also will finish out the month on Saturday evening with a virtual mixer hosted by a Pound Cake, who is an incredible influencer and activist and community organizer. We'll have music. We have some prizes to give away. And I'm a Pound Cake has some activities to help y'all mix and mingle in a virtual setting. So get as fancy as you feel like being, BYO snacks and other libations. And please join us to end the month in celebration at our Fat Virtual Mixer. That too can be signed up for on our website, naafa.org, NAAFA.org. With no further ado, I would like to introduce you to FLAIR and to our guests today. FLAIR is the Fat Legal Advocacy and Rights Education Project, and it is dedicated to the fundamental belief that fat people deserve justice, which includes equal rights under the law, as well as a leadership role in the decisions that impact fat people. FLAIR was founded as a project of the law office of Sandra Salovey. Founder Sandra Salovey, JD, is a disabled attorney, author of Tipping the Scales of Justice, and co-editor of the Fat Studies Reader. Well, I have one of those too, but I didn't get it out to hold it up. Get you one. During her career, Sandra was involved in numerous high-profile weight discrimination cases. Sandra has always recognized weight discrimination as a civil rights matter that disproportionately affects people in Black and Brown communities. In 2020, Sandra handed the reins of FLAIR over to legal director Brandie Sendziak, Esquire. FLAIR is supported by an array of dedicated volunteers, and for more information, you can visit their website, which is FLAIR Project, FLARE project.org. Brandie Sendziak is a fat, legally blind, disability and immigration attorney. In addition to her work with FLAIR, she is the supervising immigration attorney at the Homeless Advocacy Project and supervises the legal department of Independent Living Resource Center, San Francisco. Brandie also has a background in criminal defense. Ladies and gentlemen and friends of all gens, Please welcome Brandie Sendziak. And I'm so, hi, Brandie. And I'm so excited to tell you that Sandra is able to join us as a special guest today as well. Sandra, once again, is the founder of Flair Project, and Brandie is the legal director. Welcome to both of you. Sandra and Brandie, welcome to the NAAFA Webinar Series.
Thank you, Tigress.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for the great introduction.
Happy to crash the party.
Yes, thank you for crashing the party. We always love to see you. So before we get into talking about some of the broader legal issues around FAT rights, let's just talk a little bit about Brandie, how'd you get here from your other work? How'd you find Sandra? How'd you get to be the legal director of Flair?
Well, actually, so before my other work, Sandra was my torts professor in law school, and also family law professor in law school. And so we met there, and during part of our curriculum in class was about FAT rights and FAT discrimination. And so that's when I initially became more aware and got interested in the topic. And then as I learned more and it was affecting me and people I was close to, friends and family members, I just knew that I really, all my life I've been an advocate for either myself and other people, and as an attorney been an advocate, and I just knew that this was one of the areas of law that I wanted to advocate for folks and hopefully make changes.
Would y'all tell us a little bit, for folks who don't know, which I think is many of us, who else is doing this work? Is there a sort of branch of the law that specializes in FAT justice, or are y'all the branch of the law that specializes in FAT justice?
I think we are the organization that specializes in FAT justice. I don't know about any other legal FAT justice organizations.
No, I think that there are individual lawyers here and there historically who have taken on a weight case here or there. There's also some folks who are coming at weight from the weight loss perspective, who have decided it's advantageous to speak up in favor of civil rights, sort of like a wanting to basically help fat people be thin people, and saying that in terms of doing that, there shouldn't be discrimination. So there are a couple people in that camp. But as far as folks coming at weight from the perspective of not encouraging weight loss and simply looking at fat justice, Flair is the only project that I know of when I started it, and now that Brandie's doing it, it's still the only project that I know of in the world.
Thank you. And thank you for that answer, and thank you for the work. Sandra, you've been at this a really long time. Can you tell us a little bit about the early days of Flair?
It's interesting because as I've turned the project over to Brandie, and I couldn't be happier. I couldn't have found someone that I think has more the right skill set to do this work. But I've been reflecting a lot on the beginning of that and where we are as a movement. And looking at some of the other movements that have come up at the same time. So when I was starting to do this work, I was actually trying to start a nonprofit that would focus on fat justice. And it was around the time that folks were starting to do transgender justice work and transgender rights work at the same time. And so I thought a lot about the trajectory of fat rights in comparison. And I think that we have done as a community sort of what we can, but the reality is that we don't have a funded actual organization that does this kind of work. And that is what I think we need to do to create an organization where folks aren't doing a project kind of like supported by their own other work, but are actually paid to do this work with proper fundraising. And when I started, that was really, it was impossible to get grants to do this kind of work. Now there's so many more options in terms of crowdsourcing fundraising that I think it really is, there's different possibilities. But at that time, it still is very hard to get grant funding.
Well, I will say too, for individuals who may be watching or people who have connections that might want to support the work that FLAIR is doing, people are able to give to FLAIR through NAAFA's donation website, which is at naafa.org, and you can just click the contribute button, and FLAIR is one of the choices. So we do sometimes see donations come in for the work of FLAIR and pass it along to them to help them do what they're doing in the world. And so that is one way that you can support the work that you're about to hear so much more about right now. Let's move into talking a little bit about that work. Like, what are y'all focused on right now?
Well, right now, I would say our focus is sort of shifting. Before COVID, we were doing basically like a medical access project, trying to see about speaking with manufacturers of different machines, like MRI machines, CT machines, to try to get medical equipment and really important testing and diagnostic equipment that would be accessible to all bodies. But we sort of had to take a break from that when COVID started because we really knew that we needed to do something when the crisis care guidelines were coming out and they were discriminating against fat people. And so we, spent a lot of time working on the crisis care guidelines. We worked as part of Nobody is Disposable Coalition. We did Know Your Rights trainings. We did a Know Your Rights toolkit. And we worked with the state and we worked with disability organizations and the state in amending the California crisis care guidelines so that they would include basically making it so you could not make crisis care decisions based on somebody's weight and size. So that was a lot of work. And then when the vaccine became available, we did a lot of vaccine work and trying to get priority for the COVID vaccine as we were, being listed by the state of California. Fat people were being listed as people that were at, one of the highest risks of serious complications and hospitalization should we get COVID. And we really didn't have priority. And so we were really focused on getting priority. So now that work is sort of slowing down, we're transitioning back to looking at medical access and, of course, continuing to meet with individuals individually and talk about, their specific matters and cases. We've also recently been working on a little bit of advocacy in Michigan around organ transplants. There's a bill in Michigan that we would like to have amended to include height and weight. And so, yeah, I think that's sort of where we're at now.
One of the things I wanted to bring up is what are like the guiding frameworks for the FLAIR project, as it was when I started and that you have continued. And I think,
yes, thank you.
We would do a disservice to not acknowledge and thank the amazing work that's been done by fat Black women in this area and the incredible thought leadership that is from multiracial folks working in these spaces. So specifically looking at intersectionality, which is really like a fundamental framework for the way FLAIR approaches things and for why the COVID issue was such an important issue to Brandie to pursue, as well as disability justice principles. Those two approaches, and I know we don't have time to like go into that in detail, of course, because those are like whole fields of study, but that concept of intersectionality that what we need to look at from a fat justice perspective, because the law does a bad job of handling issues that come up at the intersection of different prejudices and identities. So, for example, when Professor Kimberly Crenshaw coined that phrase, she was talking about the experience of Black women. And when you look at the way the law treats folks, it will, in a rights-based approach, it will say, well, I see that you're a Black woman facing discrimination, but it's not race discrimination because look, there's other Black men working here. And it's not sex discrimination because look, there's other women working here. And so there was this way that traditional legal approaches really missed the core of what was happening. We're at the intersections. And so that's just an incredibly, it is the first principle of disability justice. And it's incredibly important to the work that FLAIR does to use that framework instead of looking at what was sort of like the common denominator. And this is, I think if you look at folks who are coming at civil rights related to weight from a weight loss perspective, they might look more at the common denominator, like, okay, let's just look at the most simple case of a person who's otherwise able-bodied, white, heterosexual, gender-conforming man who's facing weight discrimination. Like, everyone agrees that like weight discrimination is a common issue, so we'll just look at that case. And I think what FLAIR has always wanted to do is say, you know, if we look at that case and solve for that, what happens at the end? So we've got civil rights for one person with no intersectionality whatsoever. We need to go like the full other direction. We want to center the people who are in the middle of all different overlapping exponential prejudices. If we can solve the legal issue for that person, then we've solved it for everyone. And that's what justice is. And that's been the guiding principle of FLAIR.
Thank you for that explanation, and thank you for reminding us that term intersectionality, which we use a lot in social justice movements now, really is rooted in talking about legal rights and was very specific to a context of talking about legal rights having to do with race and gender, particularly for Black women. And Kimberly Crenshaw's work, it has now been expanded on to have this understanding of the way that any kind of marginalized identities interact with each other to make discrimination worse. But thank you for grounding us in that history. I will also just say before I let you all go on that for folks who want to learn more about the concept of intersectionality as it relates to fat activism, we have a webinar from a couple of years ago featuring scholar Caleb Luna and activist Tammy Johnson talking about specifically intersectionality in fat community. And also for those of you who are looking for more information about what Brandie was just talking about her work and FLAIR's work with the No Body is Disposable Coalition, we do have a webinar about that you will be able to find soon on YouTube that we filmed with members of that coalition, a few weeks ago. And so there is information for you about both of those things. And the No Body is Disposable Coalition is easy to find online, nobodyisdisposable.org. So just wanted to put that out there for folks who want to do some additional learning outside of this webinar. So let's go back to, and in that Nobody is Disposable webinar, Brandie did talk a little bit more about the principles of disability justice as well, and the difference between disability rights and disability justice movement and what intersectionality has to do with that. So there's great other learning for you from Brandie about those things. And I know that there were, you mentioned specifically in that webinar, Sins Invalid as another place where people can learn about disability justice.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so back to FLAIR.
How important that is, yes.
Yeah, it's super important, and their work is incredible. And you all should look them up and see their principles of disability justice as well. So back to FLAIR, though, one of the things you mentioned, Brandie, was that, you work with individual folks who come to you with cases. I know you can't talk about the specifics of some people's individual cases for privacy reasons, but what are the sort of broad categories that people bring to you outside of the medical discrimination that you've already talked about?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the medical discrimination is such a big category, so that
Yeah.
I really think there's, I mean, I, I I would like to talk about the medical discrimination a little bit for a second, and then we can talk about
Please.
outside things, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So within the medical discrimination, there's all sorts of things. There's, people being turned down for organ transplants because they have a BMI over 35. Um, Even when they have a known donor, like a person that's willing to donate, that's maybe their friend or family member, it doesn't matter. Hospitals still won't do these transplants. Or people being turned down for procedures that maybe need anesthesia, such as like fertility procedures like IVF, or people
kind of gender
surgeries, or people being turned down for different medical and diagnostic testing because the equipment, there's not equipment that will support higher weight or fat people, and then in addition to that, people being turned down for research studies. Just recently, someone was turned down for a research study that's being done at a really prominent institution, because basically they would not accommodate, even though I believe they have MRI machines that do have higher weight capacity. They would not accommodate this individual, and this basically the study needed an MRI every day. And when they realized that this person was over 350 pounds, they were like, nope, sorry, we're not going to do it, which is really problematic, for the individual person, but also this means these studies aren't being done on fat people. So how do we know how, it's going to work on fat people?
Right. So they tell us they can't do medical procedures on us because they don't know how to do them on fat people.
Exactly.
But when there are opportunities to learn how to do them on fat people, they reject the fat people from the possibilities of doing that research.
Exactly.
Or being part of that research.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And then, of course, then there's other areas that people come to us. There's child custody issues of people losing custody of their children. There's employment cases, where there's people that may get hired at a company, but pending a physical examination or something like that of that nature. Do you have additional areas?
Public accommodations.
Yeah.
You can't go to school because they have desks with attached, seats with attached,
right.
And you literally can't fit into the classroom, and they won't accommodate, or lift capacities on public transportation. So, there's a maximum weight for someone with their wheelchair or scooter that's too high for what the capacity of the lift is, or what the bus driver will thinks your weight is. That kind of accommodation case.
Thank you for those examples. I know that you have some slides and you wanted to take us through some basic framework. So why don't we do that before we ask more questions? And then audience, you can also be ready to start asking questions at the end of the slides. I will remind you, because there's also some other, chatting and resource sharing in the chat. If you have a question that you would like me to ask our guests, please type the word question in capital letters at the beginning of your question. It just makes it easier for us to find as we're looking through all of the other wonderful things y'all are exchanging with each other. I'm going to turn my camera off while y'all walk through your slides, or work your way through your slides, and I will be back.
Awesome. Thank you, Tigress. Well, I wanted to start off by saying that laws are tools, to fight injustices, but just because there may or may not be a specific law that covers weight discrimination, it doesn't mean you shouldn't fight if there's an injustice. And, oftentimes laws are created or case law is changed based on some, a discrimination or an injustice that someone faces and fights. So I just wanted to start there. There are also, I want to point out that a lot of times people will say, there's not a law that protects from weight discrimination, or, there's not a law in, 49 states that protect against weight discrimination. But that's very simplified, and that's, actually misleading, not true. And it really depends. So there are specific laws in some places that do protect against height and weight discrimination. Also, sometimes height and weight can be covered under disability laws, and also other laws, for example, other like sex discrimination laws or the U.S. Constitution. And yeah, so I just, wanted to point that. I wanted to, kind of explain the different types of laws that may protect against weight discrimination. And so if we could please move on to the next slide. Thank you. So where are there specific laws? So there are laws that specifically protect people from discrimination based on height and weight in San Francisco, in Binghamton, New York, and in California, but in California in relation to the COVID crisis care guidelines. And that's sort of what I was talking about before in the actual guidelines.
And the state of Michigan.
And the state of Michigan. There are laws that protect against being discriminated based on your appearance. And these laws are in Washington, D.C., in Urbana, Illinois, and in Madison, Wisconsin. There are laws that protect against discrimination based on physical characteristics, and this is in Santa Cruz, California. And there is a recent really great case law and laws that protect against obesity in Washington state.
Obesity.
Yeah.
I should say that, from my work doing this, it is actually hard to track where laws spring up. So a lot of times I would find out about a law because people would be trying to make a law and they would reach out. They would reach out to me. But if anyone knows of laws in other places, then definitely
please reach out.
Yeah, share that information. Or if people are thinking about creating a law somewhere, then reach out and get connected and learn from the folks who have done it before and share your experience.
Yes, please do. So can we move to the next slide, please?
Can I just add there really quickly another place where there's outside learning? We did do a webinar last summer with 3 folks who were part of the movement in San Francisco, Santa Cruz, and Binghamton, New York. So you can look that up on the NAAFA official YouTube channel if you want to hear the stories of folks from those 3 places and how they got involved in passing these legal protections.
And if you haven't had the chance to get a law changed where you are, I cannot recommend it highly enough. It is a life-changing event to participate in politics in that way. And it truly is more doable than you might think. So I would really encourage you to think about doing that. It doesn't take a lot of people. It doesn't necessarily take money. It just takes passion and being willing to figure it out.
And if you are doing this type of work and, want FLAIR's support or assistance, if we have capacity at the time, which we usually figure out a way to do, please reach out and feel free to reach out to us at any time at our website, or I believe our emails are on our website.
And FLAIR has historically done a lot of policy support, and it sounds like that's something that you're planning to continue.
Yes, that's definitely something that I'm continuing.
Because policy work affects a lot of people.
So this next slide, so I'm visually impaired. So if Sandra, would you be willing to read this slide? Thank you.
Right. So when people make laws, actually how you define weight is really important. And so this definition is the Binghamton definition. It also looks to me like it's probably identical to the San Francisco definition. So it says, the law says weight discrimination is illegal, or height and weight, but what does that mean? So here is the definition of weight for them. Weight is a numerical measurement of total body weight, the ratio of a person's weight in relation to height, or an individual's unique physical composition of weight through body size, shape, and proportions. Weight encompasses, but is not limited to, an impression of a person as fat or thin, regardless of the numerical measurement. An individual's body size, shape, and proportions and composition may make them appear fat or thin, regardless of numerical weight. And if I can
Yes,
add,
please.
The reason this is so important is because you could outlaw weight discrimination and then have someone say, well, it's not weight discrimination, it's BMI that we're concerned about. That's not technically just weight, it's weight in ratio to height. So you have to be really clear and not let any of this sneaky discrimination come back into your beautiful law that you've crafted. Also, you want to avoid a situation where someone who kind of looks fat because of how they carry weight would face discrimination, while someone of the same weight, because maybe they're more muscular or they're more of a sort of traditional quote unquote appealing shape, wouldn't face discrimination. Because you don't want someone to say, look, I'm not discriminating against people who weigh 200 pounds because I have someone here who weighs 200 pounds and I haven't fired them, when they're actually firing a 200-pound person who looks fat. So you want to be really clear that it's not just the number on the scale, it's not just a ratio involving the number on the scale, and it's not just how a person holds their weight. It's all of these things is how you define weight. And there's similar definitions of height. So this is the weight portion, but there'll be a similar definition in a law like this defining height.
Thank you. Can we move to the next slide, please? Would you be willing to read that?
Oh, sure. So Brandie was talking about laws that specifically mention weight. And so a lot of times, from the beginning of the time when I would do this work, people would say weight discrimination is legal in all the states except Michigan. And it is very misleading to say that. What I think the person is meaning to say is Michigan is the only state that has a law that outlaws weight discrimination. But it's not the same thing to say that weight discrimination is legal, because it may be covered by other laws. And so here, Brandie has a slide that's looking at general disability law. So generally, disability law doesn't usually mention weight protections. But here it says, example, the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in employment, state and local government, public accommodations, commercial facilities, transportation, but not airplanes, and telecommunications. The ADA protects people with a disability and people who have a relationship or association with an individual with a disability. So that's important because it's not just the disabled person that's protected, but a non-disabled person could be protected if they're facing discrimination because of their association with a disabled person.
Awesome, thank you. If we could go to the next slide now.
This is defining disability. Shall I read?
Yes, please.
So defining disability. So once you know a disabled person is protected, you have to ask, okay, well, how do you define disability? An individual with a disability is often defined as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. That's what they call the first prong. Or a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. Disability law does not usually specifically name all of the impairments that are covered. So it's not unusual that you wouldn't see the individual conditions that are covered. So the question becomes, does an individual fat person meet the definition of disability such that they would be covered by a disability law. And this is similar to the ADA's approach. Many states have approaches that are basically very similar to this approach. They might be like a little bit different here or there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can we move to the next slide, please?
Shall I read again?
Yes, please.
Okay. So it's like kind of complicated, right? So first the question is like disabilities, people with disabilities are protected. Now we looked at like, what does it mean to be disabled? Part of the definition of disability is having an impairment. So now we're looking at, okay, what's the definition of impairment? Regulations or laws often define physical or mental impairment as any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement or anatomical loss affecting one or more body systems. And then there's a list of all the body systems. So like thinking about this in relation to weight, we want to think about physical or mental impairment is a physiological disorder or condition that's affecting one or more body systems, such as neurological, musculoskeletal, sense organs, respiratory, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, and there's a whole list, lymphatic. I'm trying to read the ones that are especially relevant, potentially endocrine. So the question here is, and this is, I don't think this is a question that Brandie isn't going to answer, so you were braver than me, but is fat either a disorder or a condition? That's something that as fat people thinking about using disability law, we have to think about that. And it brings up some questions that are really important for us to ask about how we think about those terms, how we define them, and what do we actually think about disability and what stigmas do we carry against disability that might make us want to separate ourselves from the idea of being a person with a disability or being disabled. And then the next question that Brandie has is, if fat people are treated as having a disorder or condition for the purpose of discriminating or denying services, then shouldn't we be protected as having one under the law?
Thank you. Which also is so the second question is also, I think, important. And what word? I wouldn't say like problematic, but we also want to be careful when talking about fat as a condition or something that may need to get treatment. And this could come up.
That would be like the risk, right? The risk would be saying, if you're looking at fat as a condition or disorder, could someone require quote unquote treatment, and how would you push back on that? That I think is the main risk. But I think that the flip side of that is, if fat people are treated as having something wrong or having a disease or disorder or condition, then laws that protect people from being discriminated against based on those things should apply.
Absolutely.
You want to you want to say well, you're diseased, but we're not going to protect you the way we protect a person who has a disease. That's like a basic fairness problem there.
Yes.
It makes it seem much more about, I don't know, just like the pure
bias.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's the end of our slides. That's the last slide that we have. So if you want to take those down.
So audience, if you want to go ahead and start queuing up some questions in the chat, I'm happy to present those to our presenters. While I give you a second to do that, I just want to, well, first of all, thank you for all of that information. And then second of all, I want to ask, just continuing talking about that sort of like the nuances of like, if we establish ourselves as disabled because of our fat, what does that mean? Not just what does it mean to us, but what does it mean to disabled people who are not fat? And like, how do anti-fatness and ableism interplay there and also like affect our ability to work as a team with disability rights organizations and stuff? Just what are your thoughts on how those things go together, the ableism and anti-fatness, and where they are internalized in both communities and what that does?
Do you want to? answer?
I have a lot to say about that. Sorry, now I'm thinking over your webinar if I answer that question.
I mean, I will start. I think that Sandra has a great answer to this. I would like to start by saying, where you mentioned fat and disability organizations working together. I think that's one of the things that we learned from COVID. And I think that's one of the things that, Sandra with Flair has been trying to do for years. I think it's very important that we all work together. And I think that we had the success we did with the crisis care guidelines because our communities came together and advocated and worked together. But do you want to go into the other things that Tigris just mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. So I don't think that there are bright lines dividing the communities. I think that there are stigma lines dividing the communities. In my career, historically, that's what I've felt. Like within the disability world, stigmas about not wanting to be associated with fat folks and about, we were talking about that intersection. So like within disability community, how are fat people treated? What happens to a disabled fat person who can't get the MRI because they weigh more than 350 pounds? And really like centering those multiply marginalized experiences within disability community. And that's why you see like disability justice, come up to address those issues, like that lack of traditionally being able to address those intersections. And lack of leadership by people who are at those intersections. And conversely, in fat community, I think that a lot of people in fat community have wanted to distance themselves from disability, from even being perceived as disabled. And we see that a lot with like sort of like the healthy fatty or the good fatty, those kind of stereotypes. And I think that requires us to really question why is that? Like, why are we feeling the need to be so separated? What are our prejudices against people who identify as disabled? And what do we think about disability? And that's a whole separate thing about understanding like social constructions of disability, and what is disabling to people. Is there something wrong with you, or is there something wrong with the fact that there are stairs that makes it impossible for you to get to the door? Is there something wrong with you, or is there something wrong with the fact that the chair was built with arms that prevents you from fitting in it? So that's all really important. I feel like in doing this work, like going back, now multiple decades, I'm thinking like when I started the project, there have always been people in the disability community who have tried to help because they have seen the overlap and they have seen how weight is treated sort of unfairly under disability law. But the problem has been that there hasn't been that public help. So there have been individual people behind the scenes saying, I really empathize, but no one's been willing to, or people have been hesitant to actually be friends with a fat kid. So like behind closed doors, yeah, maybe we'll help, but not in public. And I really feel like that is changing and it needs to change. And when I look back at the trajectory of folks fighting for trans rights compared to folks fighting for fat rights, I see that queer community and trans community really worked together in a lot of ways and got a lot of support. And I think that fat community and disability community didn't have that close working relationship. And I think that that's been a big difference because there just hasn't been that kind of like institutional support and leadership. And then when you see resource coming in to look at weight-related stuff, it's always coming in as trying to be like basically medical money, trying to get rid of fat people, not trying to actually support fat people to live good lives and have access to quality care.
That is really an important thing for us to look at when we look at folks who say that they are advocates for fatness. Some of the people who say that they are, some of the world's largest organizations who say they are advocates for fat people are, they're the medical, quote unquote, obesity organizations. And they say that they're advocating for us, but what they're advocating for is being just nice enough for us so we will continue to be their clients so that they can help us lose weight, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's insidious. You have to really watch for it in the language around big organizations that are working towards fat rights that are not by and for fat people who have a fat liberation framework. Mm-hmm. Thank you for bringing that up. So we have a couple questions from the chat. Number one, why is it legal for car manufacturers to make seatbelts that don't fit everyone? Lives are at risk. Why is that legal?
Yeah. Sorry. I'm just excited about that question because the first national campaign that I know of was actually about seatbelts. So I get really excited when fat people are like doing cool stuff to try to fight for our rights. I mean, that campaign was not ultimately successful, but that was Elizabeth Fisher, and she was working on that exact issue. And so these are things that require like getting to know our government and advocating. So like that is just a decision about what is going to be the required amount of people that are going to be taken into account when the seatbelt regs are made. So that is an area to advocate for, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, like the one effort wasn't successful, but it would be nice if we had other people that were picking up that work, so that like one person tries, doesn't quite make it, well, we come back and we try again. And I completely agree that it is absolutely ridiculous that, even if you can get a seatbelt extender, well, is that tested? I mean, that's the thing is I want fat people to have the same rights mm-hmm. as their thinner counterparts. So if, can you all still see us?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So like, we want to know, is that seatbelt going to work? We want to know, is the extender the same thing, or does it need to be like one actual seatbelt? If a person is being required to purchase 2 seats on an airplane and have a back, like a armrest in the middle of their back, well, is that the same safety that a thin person in one seat is getting? Well, I don't know, but has that been tested? Because if not, good, give the fat person one seat that fits.
Yeah.
Don't put a fat person like straddling an armrest that's uncomfortable and might be really dangerous in a crash. That's outrageous.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. We don't know of anyone right now who is doing seatbelt work specifically, but we do know that Kaya Milstein, who is the Mechanic Shop Femme, has a survey open on that website, Mechanic Shop Femme website, for folks who are quote unquote women size 24 or men size 40 and above to self-report on cars that work well for them. And I think it includes some seatbelt questions. So Kaya is developing a database, at least as a resource for folks to know when they're shopping for cars, some useful information about that. But as far as we know, there's no one right now doing a seatbelt campaign.
It wouldn't take that much to pick up that work and try again.
This is the way that things end up getting into the future of NAAFA committee, I will say, but I am not committing us to pick up seatbelts at the moment. We're working on life insurance at the moment, and then some end of life care stuff at the moment. Y'all will hear more from us about those things soon. Next question from the chat. Do you have resource recommendations for specifically about intersections between fat and disability justice? Any specific groups or authors or advocates that you want to point out for folks?
Specific. I mean,
I feel like we could like come up with a list.
Yeah.
Off the top of my head, but we can work on that. We can work on that like in mm-hmm. conjunction with NAAFA. I think that'd be a great resource to publish.
Yeah.
I mean,
okay. So coming soon from the NAAFA and FLAIR partnership, some specific resources about intersection between disability justice and fat liberation movement. That will probably go on our blog when we work on it together. So thank you for that.
That'll be great to work on together.
And people who are in the Bay Area, there's like Disability Justice League. Mm-hmm. There's tons of stuff that's been done by SINS. There's
a lot of stuff on SINS website. Yeah.
A lot of people doing good work on this.
There are a few observations in the chat, and I'm not sure if people want to share those just with the people in the chat or out loud. So y'all, I see your observations. I'm going to work them in after we get through all the questions, if you would like me to say them out loud. There is a note and a question from Bill Fabry, who is the founder of NAAFA. In the example of Elizabeth Fisher's efforts about the seatbelts, the biggest target was Honda, and the president of Honda said he would never permit extenders. But after that, they started equipping their cars for the US markets with longer seatbelts. Not exactly a glorious victory, but that was helpful. So there are things we can do in the smaller ways, even if we don't get the national campaign. I think that's a great example of that, Bill.
I love that. And thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I love that reminder because it's so important. I think people get very disempowered or feel like things are too large to tackle, or you get this sort of sense of like, well, if weight discrimination is legal, what can I do? And that's why I think it's, we have to be careful about saying those things. It's really important to remember that even things that don't sort of succeed the way you want them to succeed in other ways. Even if it's
often just bring attention to, like, a lot of you. I was admitted in the chat that I am probably a person who has used that phrase. Oh, there are only these places where it's explicitly prohibited. And so I think my phrasing is probably a little bit better than what you pointed out as the bad phrasing, but not that much. But in the places where it's explicitly prohibited in some way or another, there are, of course, still ways that people try to get away with it, right? Like, having a law does not magically make the discrimination.
That is correct.
Resource when the discrimination happens.
Absolutely. And then you still need to contact, Flair or another, organization in your area to fight. And yeah.
Yeah, I want to underscore what you're saying, Tigris, because I think a lot of people who don't live lives where they face discrimination like all the time, or they don't face multiple types of discrimination, they don't know this. So they hit weight discrimination and they think, well, this should be wrong and someone should fix this for me. And they don't understand that just having a law doesn't make things fixed. And you still have to advocate and fight, even if there's a law. And I feel like that should be obvious, but I know that it's not obvious for a lot of people. So even if there's a law or if there's not a law, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to fight anyway. And the thing is, like, we do it as a community.
Right. We know, we talk a lot about people's concept of like the very misused phrase, fat is the last acceptable form of prejudice. Yeah. Like, we know there are laws against other kinds of prejudice and they still happen blatantly, horrifyingly, life-changingly. And so having these protections is a huge step for us in the places where we have them, and we'll have more of them in the upcoming years. But yeah, they can be somewhat preventative. How are they preventative?
Well, I think it helps to have a law, right? It may, it's something.
Then we have something we can argue,
right? There's something to fight with and for, but it's not. It's like in my when I was doing this, mostly there's not a law, so mostly you have to use other strategies. That's about like creative lawyering. That's about fundamentally like. There are laws and people will follow them or they won't, but ultimately, like, what's right or wrong in that situation? Like connecting with someone and their ethics, and are they acting in integrity with who they want to be as a person? So maybe there's a law, maybe there's not. I don't know. Do you need a law to tell you how to behave correctly? Like you can change.
Some people don't know how to do those things even with the laws, but
right, exactly. Ignore the law.
Exactly.
Yep. So the law helps. It makes it easier, but don't give up if there's no law, and don't think just because there's a law, you're not going to have to fight.
Absolutely. There's a law in San Francisco, as we talked about, and, there's still a lot of fighting for, people in San Francisco to not be discriminated against based on weight.
I think one of the things people don't know if they haven't been in a legal fight is they think, well, there's a law, so I'll just get a lawyer to fix it for me. But if your case isn't worth a lot of money, then there's not going to be a lawyer who's going to want to take your case to fix it for you. And if there's not a nonprofit organization that is set up to take cases on for free in that case, like you're going to have to fight anyway.
Right. And so I'm going to share a couple of observations that people have made here regarding the things that we're talking about. And then we'll probably have time for one or two more questions if folks have direct questions that they want to ask. Now's the time to put those in. Dr. Delphi points out that it's similar to having a law is similar to having a restraining order. It doesn't necessarily protect you, but then it gives you something to fight with later. Mycroft points out that anti-discrimination laws generally don't come with funding for dissemination, and because especially because it's most popular that places will pass them if you tell them it's not going to cost them anything to pass it. And so it takes a long time for people to find out that the law has changed. And then Bill also observes that the law in Binghamton is really amazing, and their definitions include reference to shape, which we sometimes is sometimes omitted. And so, do you think that Binghamton description that you showed us, if folks want to do something locally, they want to try to get something started where they are, is that the gold standard of the legal definition of what weight is for a law like this?
Yeah, I think my recollection, my belief is that that's taken from San Francisco. And so San Francisco has, if you haven't seen this, I can't recommend, everyone to print this out and just this is a cool document. So this is the San Francisco compliance guidelines to prohibit weight and height discrimination. And because of the way San Francisco is structured, these have the full impact of law, just like a law. And this is where you see lots of definitions and examples. So you can find this online, and I highly recommend looking at it. Yes, I like their definition, and I like the San Francisco definitions. And activists had a strong hand in creating those, and that's why they're so nice and thorough.
Including Sandra.
A lot of fat activists.
Including Sandra. Yeah. And we should say there's a lot of intersectionality, especially in San Francisco and Santa Cruz. I know those stories a little bit better. And also in Binghamton, that there's a lot of intersectionality, LGBTQIA community, and those activists working on those laws together with fat community. Okay, question. You mentioned the horrific catch-22 of medical professionals refusing to perform procedures on fat people and also not accepting fat people into studies. I've also been looking into fat people trying to have their bodies donated to science after they pass, and their surviving relatives or friends trying to fulfill their wishes, only to learn that no one will take their bodies. Have you done any work on this or heard about this sort of thing? Does discrimination law cover the dead? I will say that when I mentioned earlier that one of the things NAAFA is beginning to look at is end of life and afterlife things, we didn't mean spiritual afterlife. We meant things exactly like this. We're not going to get into the spiritual afterlife piece other than the webinar that Dr. Delphi did for us earlier this month. But the practical afterlife piece is, where does your fat body go? Does discrimination law help with any of those things?
So I don't know. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I don't personally know of any cases on that topic. So I don't know of anyone who's pushed about that. I certainly know the discrimination exists. I would assume, but I could be wrong about this, that accommodation laws would apply in that kind of situation. That, there are going to be issues, there could be some physical issues, like the size of equipment used to process people's bodies. You might not be able to make a reasonable accommodation to equipment like that, but maybe you could. So I don't know, but that's the kind of thing where you'd have to get experts involved who could really say. And if piece of equipment doesn't work, then what's the alternative, and what's the responsibility to finding an alternative? But it's a really important area because people are facing all kinds of discrimination, and that discrimination usually ends up really impacting the families that are left. And because we know that there is more higher weight in Black and Brown communities, compared to white communities, then that burden of, and I'm sorry, burden's a terrible word to say, but that the burden of the discrimination that happens that is costly is going to be disproportionately impacting certain communities of color. And that's completely wrong. And so that's another reason why it's important to fight this.
And what about the piece about donating bodies to science? Is there anything you know about that from a legal perspective?
I don't know anything about that specifically.
I know that there are prohibitions, but I think all of this is solved if there's federal legislation prohibiting weight discrimination. And these are such important questions because, some people want to do federal legislation about employment.
Yeah.
And I think if you're doing federal legislation about employment, you're coming from a privileged position. That's not what we need. We need holistic protections because we need them to apply to situations like this. Fat people need to be able to donate our bodies so that medical students can learn what it's like to work on a fat body.
Right.
Yeah. Flair's position hasn't been and won't be to, just protect fat people in employment. We need medical protections. We need custody protections, family protections, lots of other protections.
Right. This is like part of that systemic discrimination. This is how that happens. So we don't get studied. And the fact that we're not studied, we don't then get medical assistance. And we get charged more. And those charges aren't just visited on the fat person. They travel down through the people left behind when that fat person dies.
Right.
That's the systemic nature of this discrimination that has to stop.
What are some of the wins that you've seen over the years since you started Flair, Sandra or Brandie, since you've been a lawyer? Like, what are the things that you've seen that fat people have fought for that have worked legally?
So much stuff.
So
much stuff. Kids coming home. Lifeguard wannabes getting to be lifeguards. I remember. I think about one case where a person was doing such a small thing. They wanted to be a lifeguard. And one of the lifeguard tests requires you to put like a ring. You have to do some kind of rescue thing with a ring. And this person's chest was too big to fit in the ring. So they couldn't pass a lifeguard test. So they couldn't be a summer lifeguard. It's outrageous. It's ridiculous. If you want to be a lifeguard, you get to be a lifeguard.
They're strong enough in every other way to save someone's life, but they just can't get a lifesaver down around their body.
That's right, over their chest. It's outrageous. Oh my God, fat people float very well. They're excellent lifeguards.
We won the case. Lifeguards and the thin people.
There's
we're buoyant.
Yes, exactly.
From getting a child to be able to stay in a loving home, to being able to be a lifeguard. Mm-hmm. And I think you had an amazing success with California.
Yeah, the crisis care guidelines were a very, very big success. And you got the San Francisco law passed.
All the different laws, the New York law, seeing California include weight and size in these guidelines and specifically say not just disability, but weight-related disabilities. That's really impressive. Mm-hmm. Congratulations to California for seeing absolutely. That and recognizing what potentially was going very wrong and making corrections for that. Mm-hmm. So there's just tons of wins from the teeny tiny to the big. Every student who was able to take a class because they were able to get an accommodation for a chair in their classroom.
Yeah, or people that were able to get, accommodations for appropriate chairs in their workplace, right. Or, which should just be something that happens, not an actual accommodation, but
so right. Tons of successes.
Yes.
Well, is there anything that because we're closing in on the end of our available time with each other today, is there anything that we have not asked you about, that I didn't ask or the audience didn't ask, that you think is really important for us to be holding around the topics of fat rights and fat justice?
I want to say, remembering if you're doing any of this type of work, to focus on people at the intersections and the most marginalized people. Don't forget that. That's really, really the most important thing to do. And I also want to add, if you're interested, Flair is a project. We don't actually have funding, and we're a project that has a lot of volunteers. There's myself and there's several other volunteers. And if you're interested in volunteering, if you're, a lawyer or not a lawyer, an advocate, or just somebody that's interested, please contact us, reach out. We would love to talk with you, and we love volunteers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sandra, any closing thoughts from you?
I would say to be super aware of the intersection of race, disability, and weight, along with other intersections, but just making sure that weight is not being used as a legal loophole to discriminate based on race. That's something that happens a lot. So make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah. And I also want to say thank you, NAAFA, for having us. Thank you, Tigress and Darlene and everyone else who has spent time to put this together. Thank you to our ASL interpreters. You're awesome. And we really appreciate NAAFA for having ASL interpreting.
And I would say, like, for FAT community also, if you are someone who feels like extremely uncomfortable or nervous at the concept of disability or that like intersection between weight and disability, really take some time, do some reading about that, about the social construction of disability. Look at the deaf community, and because the deaf community is one that has been labeled as disabled. A lot of deaf people think of themselves as linguistic minority community, not a disability community. So look at how other groups of people have interacted with labels of disability, and just do some learning, do some thinking. And I want to thank everyone so much, and thank you, Tigress, and thank you, NAAFA, for this. And thank you, Brandie, for just, I feel so comfortable turning this role over to Brandie. I couldn't have, I think about Brandie still as that student, the first year student, sitting in the front row of my class. And I'm so proud of the work that she's done to be able to really be ready to take on Flair last year. And I just couldn't feel more confident. So I thank you for that.
And thank you, Sandra, for being here as our special guest and for all of your insight and all of the work that you've done for years.
And Sandra's book is still available online. It's, it's from a few years ago, but the issues are all still relevant. There's not a current, a new edition of it, right, Sandra? But I got my hands on one. You can get your hands on one. It's Tipping the Scales of Justice, Fighting Weight-Based Discrimination. Please buy it from your favorite used or independent bookseller. And I just want to echo all the thank yous. There's also a flurry of thank yous for the two of you and the work that Flair has done over the years and is doing now in our chat right now. Our community cannot thank you enough. There are so many aspects of fat liberation work that have been so dependent over the years on the great legal advice and your commitments, both of you. Thank you so much for that. Again, we do want to thank our friends at Pro Bono ASL. Today's interpreters were Rory and Selena, and their team has been with us all throughout Fat Liberation Month. Fantastic. We are so grateful for their work towards accessibility with us, for our community, and with all of the organizations and individuals that they work with. Please do visit them at Pro Bono ASL and tell folks about their work. And once again, we have, our culminating events of Fat Liberation Month coming up this weekend. We hope that you will join us in celebration of the end of this month. Part of the reason that we did this month, and part of the reason that we put Flair right at the very sort of capstone place of our educational programming for this month, is because we want this month to fortify you so that we can all work together to do more of the kind of things that Brandie and Sandra were talking about with us today. We have some plans in the work with NAAFA. We too are a volunteer organization. If you're interested in volunteering, you can use the contact form at naafa.org to let us know that you'd like to volunteer. And if there's one of these specific subjects from today that you'd like to volunteer to work with us on, especially if you're willing to take some leadership in that volunteering, we would love to have you. We would love to have you join us in helping us expand some of the work that we have talked about today. And of course, shout out to all the other incredible fat social organizations and fat rights organizations who operate from a fat liberation framework in the many, many kinds of things is that they do, we're just going to be seeing a lot more unity of organizations in working towards some of these justice issues. And Flair, we will be looking to you for your expertise and guidance all along the way. Thank you all for being with us. And we will see you this Saturday for the Fat Trivia Challenge and the virtual mixer party. We'll see you then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.